Awesome. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to CSS1. So now we're going to teach you about how to style your HTML up, which I'm sure you guys can tell from the previous lecture. Things weren't very fancy looking. It was kind of just bare bone structure. So today we'll teach you guys how to kind of style it up. A lot of things that make a website like intuitive, easy to navigate through is through the CSS. Okay, so let me first get some announcements out of the way. Okay, so we have homework 0 that's due today. And homework 1 was due Wednesday, but if you haven't seen the recent ed post announcement, there was actually a slight mess up with the autograder. We tried, I know a lot of students were concerned that the autograder was too strict. So we loosened it and then accidentally made a mistake by giving everyone 30s out of 30. So we're about to fix that. I think Drew already might be on it, but we're gonna make it so that it's due on Friday instead. So totally our mess up. Don't let it stress you out. Just get it in by Friday. And yeah, that should be all good. Okay. All right, let me start on these slides. Okay. Alrighty, so as I mentioned, we're teaching CSS1 today. And to go over what CSS is, let's go back to the house analogy. So I'm not sure if this was taught in HTML1, but HTML is kind of your bare bones structures, kind of in the house, your raw materials. So like this house right here, it's your basic like wood structure, not very creative, not very exciting, but it's kind of what you need as your actual material and content on your website. So right now we have this, it's a house, not very cute house though. But with CSS, you can add the styling. So now your wooden frame can be more exciting. It can have some colors, like some shade of white or shade of red. You can round up your house. I don't know why you would want a round house, but maybe in this case, this house is kind of looking kind of jazzy. A lot of times in websites, things aren't really like exactly 90-degree angles all the time nowadays. A lot of times the borders have a little slight round to them. That's kind of like more in style these days. So you can do stuff like that, like border radius. You can change the layout of your furniture. So this would kind of be done through like display flex, which is something that's very, very important and one of the biggest ideas of CSS, which we'll go into more into CSS2. Today is just kind of just a general idea of getting to know more about how to use CSS and what CSS is. And obviously much, much more, like everything that lays out the styling, the color, the format is all done by CSS. Yes, and also if you guys have any questions, feel free to put it into the chat or go ahead and stop me at any time. I'll also leave a little pause in between for questions. Okay, so let's kind of take this more into the web and less into the house analogy. This is Facebook right here. So it's very, very ugly. It's that typical blue color that you see on every website when it's not rendering correctly. This is Facebook in its basic HTML style. So as you can see, it's kind of just a long list of HTML tags. Like we have your paragraphs, we have your headers, we have your inputs, but it's usable, but it's not very intuitive. It's not very nice looking. No colors, one font only. Hashtag would not use. And this is kind of how Facebook looks like now. So as you can see, it's kind of jazzed up. There's such thing as dark mode. There's such thing as light mode. This is all enabled by CSS. So a lot of things that are also done by CSS is resizableness, which is also called responsiveness. So this is also when people have different size screens. So if you're on a mobile phone versus on your laptop, this is something else that CSS can do. Obviously different fonts, as I mentioned before, structure and layout. are all enabled by CSS. So it's kind of like you're just giving a bunch of rules to your website. So instead of just having HTML, just be like, oh, we want this sidebar to be black. And on top of it, we want this kind of font, these kind of icons to be this sort of size and stuff like that. So it's kind of just straight directions. Yeah, and to kind of give you guys a little idea of how to like structure your websites, a lot of the times, like, let's take a look at like this slideshow. This is like the outer side is the end of your laptop. That's the end of your screen. And in the inside, this is like another component. We like to call it components. That's something that we'll go into more in the React section. But if we think about it in terms of components, the smaller kind of like screen within the screen is its own component. And within, there's like some sort of margin here, which we'll talk about later. And then within this itself, there's some sort of padding. So everything really can be done by CSS. It's just kind of how you break it down into thinking about it stylistically. And a lot of the time, it's also format wise as well. If you see right here, there's a left side and also a right side. So that's something you can do by display flex. You can have your outer parent component be this outer frame, and then you can have another object. Maybe this could be an HTML image on the left and another HTML like paragraph tag on the right. And if you do like display flex, that will kind of make your two components into a row instead of just being straight column like the slide before, like this. Everything, as you can see, is just straight column, not really getting too creative. But yeah, that's just kind of how to first give you guys a stylistic intuition. And we'll go over the like more nitty gritty, what kind of commands they look like in the future slides. But I hope you kind of like get the idea. Something else that I like to mention is we can't go through like all the CSS tags and commands because there's just so many of them. So we just want to give you guys the most important ones. And obviously, if there's something that you want to do that's a little bit more creative in your future, like maybe if you want to hover over something and you want it to do a cute like animation, that's something you can search up on the web. Like how do you hover over with and make it have like an animation? That's something you can kind of supplement after learning the basics of CSS. Okay, let me check if there are any questions. Yes, so we will post, yeah, the slides are on the weekly posts. And yeah, looks good. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to put it into the chat. Okay, so forgive the typos, wasn't able to change it in time, but this is kind of thinking back on what you guys learned in the last lecture, HTML. So thinking back on that, you had your tags and your classes and your IDs. Those were like the kind of main ideas that we talked about. Your tags looked like divs, H3, unordered lists, paragraphs, and many, many more. And we have your classes, and that's when you want to provide a specific like name to your tag. So that's like class equals class name. Classes are when you have like multiple of them. IDs are when they're very specific things to your one page. You only want it to use like once or twice max. So these are kind of how the syntax looks like for them. And how CSS works is that it kind of searches for these tags, classes, and IDs in the HTML and kind of grabs them to style them. So for example, you can have elements with the class name container, and you can kind of say color equal red, and that will make the text red. And another example, if you want paragraphs, you can do P and then make the size, I think it's called font size, to be 14. Okay, so kind of getting into how this looks like on your actual code. This is the CSS syntax. So this would all happen on a CSS file. So this, you might have created like an index.html in your previous homework assignment. now you would be creating like an index.css, and that would be integrated into the HTML, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. But in your CSS file, this is kind of how the syntax looks like. So you can grab a tag like h2, header 2, and then you use like curly brackets, and inside of it, you have what we call a property. So this could be color, this could be background color, this could be border radius, width, height. There's so many endless tags that you probably can explore a little bit more on your own. But the main ones are like color and width and height. And on to the right, we have your value. And all of them have to be ended with a semicolon, or else it's going to bug out. So make sure you check that that is there. Okay, so how do we actually put CSS into your website, into your HTML file? I'll talk about this in this slide. So there are 3 ways to do it. There's only one correct way to do it, but I'll talk about all 3 ways, just so you guys get the idea. There's 3 correct ways, but one is very standard, and that will be the last one that I'll talk about. So the first one is called a style attribute. I wish I had an example here. I might just like search it up and show you guys an example, but the HTML tags, like they can have a style attribute. So it's the same way as class name is a thing. Class name equals, you put your class name. You can also have style equals, in quotes, whatever style you want. And we'll talk a little bit more about I cannot say this word, about like hierarchy of like CSS grabbing, basically, and kind of like overriding and like how specific you can get. But the style attributes is the most specific form of grabbing that you can get. So it will override any other styling that you put into it. So I'll talk about that into the next slide a little bit more. If that's a little bit confusing, feel free to ask questions about that. And yeah, let's see if I can actually search up a photo of how that looks like if you guys are curious. All right, I'll just search a style tag HTML. So let's see. Well, actually, we'll call it inline HTML. Okay, so I guess another way of calling it instead of style attribute is inline styling. That's because it kind of looks like this. It's like your p tag with the style equals font size 32px. So it's just straight inside of your HTML like line. There's a big X here because it's not known for being a good way of writing your CSS, because if you can imagine, if you have a lot of things, it can get really messy. It's not the most standard practice. Okay, we also have the style tag. So the style tag kind of looks like, see where I could find it. It's kind of just, I think I pulled one up earlier. Yeah, so style tag kind of just looks like this. There's like a style tag on its own. It's usually in between the head. And then that kind of is just like where you put all your CSS. This is just so you don't have to create a new file. I will also say this is not very common either. This is usually common in demos where people don't want to create a new file because it's like hard to navigate. So you'll see this a lot, maybe even on our website, you'll see this, but it's not very common in the actual industry. What's most common is to have a link tag. So I kind of showed an example down here. In the head section, again, you'll have like a link tag. And then inside the href, you'll put the name of your, whatever your CSS file is called, which by most standard industry practices, it's whatever your HTML file is called, except end it with .css instead. And then you also have to have this rel equal style sheet just to let them know that this is the CSS that you're connecting to it. So as it says here, it's the most common, it's the most organized, and it's just best practice to keep it like separate from the HTML. Yeah. Okay, are there any questions so far? Okay, we have a question that says, is it kind of like changing the theme? Interesting question. So do you mean like, what exactly do you mean by it? But in general, if you're talking about CSS in general, it's not exactly like changing the theme. It's more like just changing the style in general. If you're saying like being able to change a theme, it can. There's a lot of like things that you can do, like dark mode, light mode. Yeah, so I'm not really sure if that exactly answered your question, but I guess you can kind of think of it as giving you the ability to change the theme. Okay, if there are no further questions. Okay, I shall continue. All right, so if you want to actually grab the elements, I'm now going to talk more about what I was talking about earlier in the form of hierarchies of the selectors. So we haven't talked about the universal tag yet. I'll talk about that in a bit, but this is kind of the hierarchy of which is the most, I guess, like on top, if you imagine it as a layer. For example, if you say, if you're a universal selector, I want the background to be black. And then you say with the ID, you want the background to be blue. It clashes a little bit. And then that's kind of like, oh, what do we do in that situation, right? So kind of this idea of a hierarchy is basically saying that ID is more important than a universal selector. So in this case, our background wouldn't be black and it would be blue, I think is the color that I mentioned. So yeah, this is the order. Universal selector is at the worst, least strongest. Then we have your tag, then we have the class and the ID, and then we have the style tag. The style tag, as mentioned before, is kind of when you insert it as a tag in HTML. And then even more above that, the most powerful one, I guess you can call it, is the style attribute. So that one is the one where it's kind of like in line with the HTML. Yeah, okay. And what this bullet point is kind of mentioning, so an element can actually have multiple classes. And I guess the way that you can do that, maybe I should write it out. You can actually have like, let's do this kind of on the whim. Let's change this to, so you can have like a class name, and then you can have like style 1, style 2, style 3. So you can actually have a lot of class names. It doesn't have to just be one. And you can have an ID as well in the same way. So you don't have to be limited to just like thinking about one. Okay. Alrighty. No questions. I will continue onward. Okay, so talking about the universal selector, this is basically a selector that takes all of your CSS classes in your document. So oftentimes this is used when you want to change like the background color or give your website a strict margin. So a lot of margins you want to do like 10 pixels. Then you want that to be usually throughout your whole page. So that's kind of when you would use the universal selector. So just to remember again, it affects all of your CSS classes. And as I mentioned before, it's really specific and it doesn't override any other of the selectors. And then we have your tag selector. So I think there was an example before, but we had like header 3, header 1. You can grab your image tags. Sometimes like a use case that I can think of for your image tags, you might want to make them so that they're all the same size, that they're all cropped the same way. And maybe you want them to be like a circle or something. Most of the time in a website, your images kind of look standardized through the whole way. So you kind of want to grab that tag and make all your images the same size. I think the whole idea is just so that you don't have a lot of redundant code and that it's all synchronized and looks the same throughout the whole web page. So that's another selector. And yeah, here's just another example. They wanted to change the font color to yellow, and they wanted to change the width of the header to 20 pixels. Yeah, are there any questions so far? All right, if not, Abby will continue the rest of the slides. Let me stop share.
Hi everyone, I'm here to take over for the second part of CSS. So let me just pull up my slides now.
Sure, we can use this time to give like a 3-minute break, 3 to 5 minute break. Actually, let's come back at 3:07. Oh, I don't know why I said 7:07.
Okay. Recording. And then let me share my screen. Okay, so I believe we left off at class selectors. Since no one is saying anything, I hope that's right. So next, we'll be talking about selecting elements by their class. So here you can assign many different elements the same class. So it's really nice for grouping maybe like specific things you have in your HTML. Maybe you want all your buttons to look the same. So this is really good for that. So in your CSS, you'll begin the class name with a period before whatever you named it. So in like this example, this person, they named their class grid, and then they were able to select that with a period before grid. And then here they just basically said anything with the class name grid is I'm gonna make it the color red, and I'm gonna make it 20 pixels wide. Oh. Okay, next is finally at the very bottom of the hierarchy, the ID selector. So these will get an element with a specified ID, some very unique name that you gave an element. Typically, these are avoided just because it's usually not needed and it's really just to target something super specific. So for example, if you did want all your buttons to look the same, you shouldn't be doing like different IDs for each of them, but like making them all the same style. So usually it's something for like just very specific on your page that you aren't able to kind of relate styles to another element. So yeah, typically used for elements that only appear once on a page. In your CSS, the way you'll access that is with a hashtag or a pound sign. So here they have an ID named header block, and that will access just one specific element on the page that they said has a ID header block. Next is, again, this sort of like in style CSS, which is right in the HTML file. So actually Kim did like show very good examples at this earlier, where you can do a style tag, which you'll see on the left at like the very beginning of your HTML file, where you can then specify different styles. Like you can grab a tag, a class, an ID. So here they just grab the tag H1. And then on the right, you'll see more of this. I think this is like what inline CSS styling is, where you just say the word style right after your opening tag, and then following like whatever style you want. So here they said like, I'm gonna make this text color blue. So I guess one good example, maybe if you really want to try out and use inline CSS, is if you have a very specific style that you kind of want just for one element, sort of similar to an ID, but maybe it's just like a very small styling. Like here, color equals blue is just one kind of style attribute. So you don't, maybe you're like too lazy to navigate to a whole new CSS file or something. So here are some very common properties for styling text in CSS. Definitely do not memorize these. Like, I think they just come with a lot of practice, and I like probably don't know any of these like off the top of my head. I always get them mixed up, but here like color for text would be the text color, font size, font family would be the font you're choosing, I guess, but I guess family is more specific. Font weight, you have text align. Do you want it to align to the left, the center, the right of the page? Letter spacing would, adjust the spacing between your different letters. Line height, text decoration, I believe is like underlining or maybe like italics. I'm not too sure about text decoration for that one. And then text transform, which I also is very specific. I don't know at the top of my head, but usually if I'm using a CSS style or I want to style a text a very specific way, I will like the first place I'll go to is Google, and just, you'll get the exact property you need. There's like just so many. That's why I like do not recommend trying to memorize so many. And then here are just more general properties. So that last one was specifically for text. This one, it will work for most things. There's background color, background image, opacity, z-index, which kind of is like layering of elements on your page. So if something has like a z-index of -1 and then one has a z-index of 1, then the one with the positive one would be like in front, if you can think about it in layers. And then you can also adjust width and height. Maybe you want to put like a little shadow behind your element. Maybe you want to put like a rounded border. So yeah, all of these are really nice, and you can definitely think of some really cool styles for your HTML pages with these. Next, something about the units and measurements in CSS. So again, you have all these basically like tools to adjust the size of your items or your elements. Maybe you want to like change the width, the height, the text size. You hear the different units that you can use. So the first one we have is pixels, and that's just very standard, like pixels on a screen. Next is percentage. So this would be the percentage of your parent element size. So it's relative to, I guess, like the element above it. So that's nice if like maybe you made a div and then you put text in it. Like you want the text to be sized relative to that div that's holding it. Next you have rem and m. I don't know if they're said like that. That's how I say it. But rem is relative to the size of the root element's text. So I believe that would be relative to like the entire HTML styling. Like I believe the universal tag, whatever you put in there, it's relative to that. And then M is just more relative to the size of the element's text. That's like a lot more local, I guess. That's how I think of it. And then next we have view height and view width, or VHVW, which is a size relative to the viewport height and the viewport width. So the viewport is, if you like look in your browser, like for example, I use Google Chrome, your viewport will be all the screen like under your bookmark bar. So your window is like your entire like Chrome window, but your viewport is like just that screen part. So yeah, here's an example, like 40 VH equals 40% of the height of the viewport. So this is really nice when it comes to styling something called responsive styling. So maybe you want your style to look good on like an iPhone and an iPad and a laptop. And maybe you want it to look good when you're resizing a window, maybe when like you size it to half. So that's really nice. And here's a column about how to specify colors in CSS. So there's, some nice like convenient ways. First, there's predefined colors actually. So for a lot of really basic colors like red, pink, you can just literally type in the word pink and it'll come up and it'll set whatever you want to be set to pink. Next, you can use Rgba, which is formatted like this in parentheses. So the first, the second, and the third element in the parentheses would stand for like your R value, your green value, your blue value. And then the last fourth value is the A actually stands for alpha. So you're able to control like the opacity of that color. And then next, RGB is just without the A. So it just assumes like full opacity. And then finally, we have hex, which is just, you can use, a hex color code if you don't want to use RGB. So let's see. Okay, so next I'll talk about the box model, which is super, I guess, common when talking about designing websites and styling websites. So maybe some of you have seen this image before. If you guys have like played around with inspect element, this little box model is usually at the bottom of that little sidebar. So a good analogy to kind of think about it is a gift box. So we'll start from inside and then go out. So at the very inside, if you see the little like blue square with the numbers in it, you'll see the width and the height of your element. So you can kind of think of that as like the size of the gift itself, the item itself. Next is padding, which is the green color coded rectangle around that kind of borders the blue one. And you can kind of think of that as like the amount of tissue paper between the gift and like the bag it's in or something like that. So here, actually, like in HTML, that would be the space between your, I guess, your contents of your element and a border around it. Next is border, where you can think of this as like the amount of wrapping paper you use to wrap your gift. Usually, I think by default, a lot of things in HTML don't have a border already. So, you know, it's just like, if it's text, like you'll just see text. If it's like, I don't even know what another good like tag is for that, but usually things will not come with a border. So if you like, going back to the analogy, if you like wrap your box in like 20 layers of wrapping paper, then you'll see like a very thick border around. And then finally, we have margin, which is the amount of space between your element and other elements in the page, which you can also think of the analogy, the amount of space between your gift box and other boxes around it, or just other items around in its space. So if you have like two buttons together and you increase the margin, like the space between them will grow. And then next, I want to point out some developer tools that are really nice just when coding like websites. So I hope like everyone's had the joy of playing with the inspect element like on any kind of browser. They're all pretty built into all browsers, Chrome, Safari, Firefox. And I can show you like a little demo on how to use it, but here in text, like to open, you can just hit Control Command Shift C, which actually I've never done, but usually I right click and press inspect. And that's kind of like a really good tool to just, or it leads you to a bunch of really good tools to kind of work with your project. And yes, this will be your front end best friend. And here's some things that you can do with DevTools. So if you've ever like inspect element, like change a little thing on the website, you can do that. And in terms of development, you could do that and see like different changes that you might want to implement before like actually having to write the code, which is really nice. So yeah, you can click on divs on the website to see their styling, where their styling comes from, like, oh, I want to know what font this is. I want to see like how big they made this div. Next, there's this really cool tool called Lighthouse, which shows how, I guess, like fast your site is or how accessible it is. You can make updates to your code and see updates in real time, as I said, like before even changing your real code. And you can also, this like gets more into like more complex websites, but you can check the network tab to see different server responses and interactions. And let me just look at chat real quick. Oh, does round stand for anything? Yes. Oh, yes, it does stand for root elements. I guess no, it just stands for like root element. So REM, yeah, element. And then here are just some good practices, some best practices when working with CSS. So one is to comment in your CSS a lot. People definitely, if you like look at any CSS files like randomly, maybe on like some big projects, you'll see usually every kind of styling will have comments above it just to tell you what exactly it's for, maybe like what it does. So like, I guess it's just to give more description to maybe your class names or your ID. Like styling, like for example, a typical comment could be styling for submit button, something like that. And then a nice thing to do that you can do in CSS is use grouped selectors if you're styling different things, but the same way. So that is the kind of example on that right side, where all their H1s, H2s, and Ps look the same. So they were able to just separate them with commas and then just put whatever styling. So then that text align center, that color red, they only had to write it once, but all their H1s, H2s, Ps are styled like that. Finally, your CSS files should all start with this universal selector, the little star. That's just kind of for your own like convenience and to sort of have control over like the default state. I kind of think about it as your HTML file. So like maybe you want everything to just start off like black and something like that. Like you can really control what your elements kind of default to. And then sometimes people like to just use the universal selector and assign like margin 0, padding 0, because sometimes I think it like helps with some border like bugs. But yeah, it's just nice to kind of think about like how your page will look in the future and just sort of adjust that. So I think that's it for slides, but I definitely want to show you guys a demo I made just to show you like what this looks like in code and how it can change, I guess. So I just want to make sure you guys can see my code. If you guys see my HTML file, let me know. Okay, nice. So here you see I have just like a pretty plain HTML file, very small body. I have an H1, an H2, and 2 buttons. Oops, 2 buttons. And you'll see actually this next tab, I have a CSS file called styles. And I kind of just put like some random little stuff in here. But first, let me just show you my HTML file. So one thing I first want to point out in the head is how to link your style sheet to your HTML. So you'll use this link tag, and these are like very, I guess, not default, but this is basically what you have to type in every time you want to link your style sheet to HTML. Like you have to specify these 2 attributes every single time just to like tell your computer like, oh, what type it is, you know, what's it going to be. Your href is actually going to be the name of your CSS file. So mine is styles.css, as I told you before. So that's how it knows like where to find it. And I cannot like tell you guys how many times I thought like my code is broken, my CSS was like all this garbage because it wasn't showing up, but it was just always my fault because I always forgot to link it. So just remember, always remember. And then in my body, yeah, again, very simple, like just an H1 and H2, 2 buttons, one with, or both of them, I gave them a class called my buttons. And then for the second one, you'll see I gave it an ID called better button. So let's just see. Actually, now I'll take you to my styles. So here at the very top, I want to show like how universal selector might look like. So I'm gonna actually comment this all out just to show you like, just to show you essentially like what my page would look like without like any of this. Why? I'll fix that later. What? Why is it yellow again? Is it because of this? Okay, yeah, it was because of that. Okay, maybe, yeah, inline like comments are not the best. Okay, so so here is my HTML file and CSS styling. If you saw in my universal selector, I basically wanted all my text to be in the center. I wanted this like sort of dark gray color. I'm using the hex color sort of format here. So you'll see like 1E, 1E, 1E. And that's just a dark gray. And you'll see kind of like a little preview of the color right here. And then I just made all my font family to be monospace. So here it is. It's not the cutest, but you see kind of like how everything defaults to monospace font, and everything's in the center, and my background is like this dark gray color. Okay. So next I want to show how to use tag selectors. So here I selected the tag body. I know this is like not a common one to like use throughout an HTML, but like every HTML one does have it. So I just kind of want to show that. And then using another tag selector, but for H2. So body, I made text color white, and then in H2, I want to show the RGB format of color. So here it is. And oops, sorry. And now look at that. Everything, or except buttons are a very like little tricky thing, but everything is white, but then H2 actually overrode that body selector. And now this specific line is pink. Actually, I just want to show you that like both of them were white before that H2. So yeah, so if I just did body, it would be white, but because that H2 is a little more specific, it overrode it with that pink color. So finally, to style these very horrible buttons, I'm going to access my class called My Buttons, which I assigned again to both of my button tags. And here you can see like all these different kind of attributes I'm doing to it. And even though it looks like a lot, it actually is like very small. In like there are much longer style sheets that look just like crazy. So here I'm just like making a different background color. I'm assigning the text white again. I'm saying don't give it a border, because by default, if you notice that buttons do have like kind of a small border around it. I'm setting text decoration to none, because I think by default buttons also have like an underline on the words like inside. And then I'm giving it some padding to make it a little bigger, and then also increasing the font size so it's bigger. So now my buttons look like this, all nice and pretty. Well, not super pretty, but now they're like a lot more readable and just like a nicer color. I took off its borders and some random text decorations. Let me see this comment. How does CSS know that .my buttons correspond to button in HTML? Actually, it doesn't. So it's just kind of trusting me that I know what I'm doing, and like I know that, I mean, you could probably assign these attributes to maybe like a p tag or a div tag, and it might come out different. But yeah, it doesn't know that I'm doing specifically buttons. So that's just something I guess to keep in mind. And yeah, keep in mind like when designing your CSS files. And then finally, I want to show you the, I guess, like overriding power of I guess, the very bottom, or would that be the top of the hierarchy? Well, the ID, better button. So here I just commented out, and here I'm sending the background image to this really cool gradient. Yeah, I did not know this like off the top of my head. I just like searched how to make a gradient in CSS. So yeah, this is how you do it. I guess it has a bunch of different parameters. But there's some like really cool tools online where it'll let you maybe like create a gradient and then just give you a single line of CSS to copy and paste into your code. So there's like a bunch of cool tools like that outside. So now my button is a super awesome gradient, and it is the better button, and it looks way better. And yeah, so you saw that even though it did have that class of my buttons, I gave it that specific ID, and then it just took that ID and applied it to that and overrode whatever styling I had before. So I guess to also point out though that even though it does override that styling, you'll see like it's still, the text at least is still white. So kind of use the styling from the class as a default almost, and then just overrode what it can overrode. So yeah, I guess I'll show how to use, or how to, yeah, really like play around with inspect element. Oh yeah, I made this like super tiny and just zoomed in for you guys, but if you guys ever, yeah, this might seem like a little familiar, inspect element. So what comes up first is like my entire HTML page, which is like really nice because I could just, I'm used to this. I wrote this, you know, I know where everything is. So I can access like my H1, my H2, I can access my better button. And then you'll see on the right sidebar, all its styling. So it's very similarly formatted like my CSS file. You'll see like everything is separated by those curly brackets. Everything has the like period and the hashtag. So here I can like, maybe I'm like, oh, actually, I don't know if I really want to keep that background image. I can just click off that little checkbox and see like, oh, do I like that better? Oh wait, let me bring it back. Okay. And I can just play around with like all its different stylings. Like I can just go crazy. And all while I'm doing this, like my actual code isn't changing, which is really nice because you don't have to commit, basically commit. By commit, I mean like just write the code and stuff. But yeah, it's just really nice in general just to like kind of play around, be like, oh, let me see what this looks like with like different padding. You can also edit it right here. So let's go like crazy and do like 50 pixels. Like that's huge. Let me go back to 10 because I like that better. And oh yeah, so that's like one really nice feature at least. And then here you'll see my box model. Every element has this. Again, I am highlighted over my better button. So this is the box model for my better button. And it highlights what exactly it, like your element corresponds to in the box model. So here I'm hovering over padding. So it's showing me on my element exactly like what the padding is. And then here with like the little blue box, it's showing me like what my, I guess, element content is. It's no, click me. Border, I have none, so it's like not showing at all. And then I didn't set a margin either, so that's why it's not showing it. But yeah, it's really nice to just like understand how you're sizing everything. And it's really nice with like way more complicated HTMLs. Obviously, like this is super tiny and maybe you don't need a whole box model for this, but yeah. And then you can kind of just like, here's a network tab that I was talking about earlier, and then Lighthouse, which actually I've never used, but here you can also access Lighthouse and like analyze how your page loads, how accessible it is. It has like all these super cool categories. And yeah, that was just my small demo. If you guys want, I can just like share the code somewhere, but it's very simple. And I definitely recommend playing with it by yourself and just like trying out different styles, seeing what it has to choose, like Googling different attributes and like different styling stuff you can do, because there's way more than I just have like in this small, 31 line file. And yeah, let me stop sharing because that's it. But yeah, if you guys have any more questions, I believe, yeah, that's it from me. I'll pass it on to Kim.
Yeah, I don't think I have too much to add, but just like the personal advice, like I know a lot of people or a lot of students who start the CSS homework get a little bit confused sometimes. And I think the biggest blocker, I think, is that you just like need to experiment more. Like CSS is not like something that you just memorize, like Abby mentioned. A lot of the times it's just something that comes with practice. So if you like experiment with it, it doesn't work, just try something else. And as well as what Abby mentioned about the inspect elements, which I believe is right click, just right click and then inspect element. Kind of using that tool just to check like what's like the reasoning for why things are looking that way. Why is it not looking that way? A lot of the times it could be because another component is blocking some sort of other component. A lot of the times it could be also maybe like specifying width to be like 90%, but the parent itself doesn't even have a width like assigned to it. So it could be stuff like that that you can like investigate a lot more closer if you use your developer tools properly. So that's just kind of a tip that I have for CSS. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. If you guys have any last questions, Abby and I can answer them. And yeah, I don't think there's too much to announce as well. Make sure you guys get your week 0 attendance up, and we'll probably release the week 1 attendance after Wednesday's lecture. But thank you guys for showing up. Let me know if you guys have any questions. So attendance is done by the weekly quizzes. So they're on Gradescope. I think week 0's is already up. I believe it's due on the 23rd or something like that. Don't take my word, make sure to check. But yeah, it's just a very simple, like 5, I don't know about simple. Okay, it should be simple if you watch the lecture is our goal. And then there's only like 5, 6 questions on it usually, so it wouldn't be too complicated. But make sure to do that to get credit for coming to lecture.